ready. You got Avon? You can hear everything okay?
Yep.
Stand by. Five, four, three.
Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Yvonne Winget-Sanchez, and I cover state politics for azcentral.com and the Arizona Republic. In November, Arizona voters will be asked if they want to legalize marijuana for recreational use. Today, we're debating the pros and cons of legalization as part of the USA Today Network's Facebook Live 2016 series. If you have a question, please type it in the comment section or tweet it to us at AZ Central. If passed, Proposition 205 would allow adults 21 years and older to use, carry, and grow marijuana. Licensed stores would sell marijuana, and marijuana would be taxed at 15%. Revenue would fund a new state department that would be created to oversee the stores, and tax proceeds would go to local governments that have marijuana-related businesses within their boundaries, to education, to this new department, and to fund substance abuse programs. According to our recent polling, half of voters support marijuana legalization, so the Yes campaign starts out ahead. About 40% of voters in the Arizona Republic Morrison Institute Cronkite News poll said they would not back the measure, and a sizable share of voters were undecided. The gentlemen joining us today are decided on the issue, and Mr. J.P. Holyoke, he's the chairman of the campaign to regulate marijuana like alcohol. He operates 2 medical marijuana dispensaries, and he will argue in favor of Proposition 205.
Thanks for having me today.
Thanks for joining us. Mr. Montgomery is the county attorney of Maricopa County. He has been a vocal critic of marijuana in Arizona. He has endorsed Arizonans for Responsible Drug Policy, and he will argue against Proposition 205. I have drafted the questions. They have not been shared with either side. Each side will have 90 seconds to respond to a question, and Mr. Holyoke and Mr. Montgomery will have an opportunity to respond to each other if it is called for. It's my prerogative to direct a deeper discussion on any point. And again, if you have a question, please, we want to hear from you. Just type it in the Facebook comments field or send a tweet to azcentral.com. Our social media team is monitoring our channels, and we will pose several of your questions to our guests. We will do the coin flip. I forgot to do that earlier.
Do you have to call it?
Heads or tails, Mr. Montgomery? Heads or tails?
Heads. Tails.
Okay. Tails. Opening statement, Mr. Holyoke.
This is relatively simple, I think. This isn't a question of yes marijuana or no marijuana, because prohibition has been an abject failure. It's out there in our society. It's easily and readily available to anybody that wants it today. So the question really is, are we going to tax it and regulate it and send those dollars to our underfunded schools, or are we simply going to keep it illegal for the enrichment of criminal drug dealers? When we look at Colorado, in 2015, they collected about $135 million in taxes. That's what went to the state in Colorado. The JLBC here in Arizona, in its second year, essentially its first full year of implementation, estimated that our taxes would be about $120 million. That's both taxes and fees. So when we look at this, that's a substantial chunk of money that's not going to criminal drug cartels, and it is instead staying in our state with a significant portion of that going to our schools, and then also using it to fund education regarding drugs, alcohol, and other substances. It just makes sense.
Mr. Montgomery.
Of course, I beg to differ. Masquerading as a windfall for safe communities and education funding, Proposition 205 undermines local control, would be voter protected, preventing legislative changes for problems that develop, keep Arizonans from being able to impose restrictions on driving from impaired by marijuana like we do for alcohol, increase risks of vehicle crashes and deaths, impact drug-free workplace policies, establishes new government bureaucracies with sweeping control different than how we regulate alcohol, and protects markets for current dispensary owners. Arizonans should vote no on Prop 205. Even people in favor of marijuana legalization conclude Prop 205 is bad for Arizona, and we should vote no. Last week, Professor Mark Kleiman, who supports marijuana legalization, concluded after a forum at ASU that Prop 205 is a bad idea, and Arizona should vote no because of special interest protections without meaningful restrictions to protect public health. Are communities safer? Well, Washington State saw marijuana-related traffic fatalities double. Colorado saw them go up 64%. Oregon saw marijuana DUI arrests increase over 160%. Emergency room visits for children in Colorado who accidentally ate edibles, like gummy bears and other kid-friendly candies, increased 600%. And that's with edibles that have THC concentrations up to 90%. To deal with this public health disaster, Colorado outlawed the sale of edibles that children were eating. Arizona's Voter Protection Act won't let us do that. And dispensary owners wrote into Prop 205 language that restricts regulations that would have too great an impact on their businesses. Prop 205 won't let Arizona towns and counties opt out of recreational sales like they can in Colorado. And the cost to run the new Department of Marijuana and Department of Revenue will not leave enough money for schools to make a difference. Even with the optimistic estimates of revenue, it comes out to be $30 per student the first year and $56 per student the second year. Having just approved Prop 123 that pumps over $3 billion into education, the negative impacts to teen development and risks of addiction due to increased THC content render these paltry sums meaningless. Vote no on Prop 205 and truly keep our communities safe and protect education.
Thank you, gentlemen. Well, the pro side has said that legal marijuana will bring an end to the illegal market. JP, you've said the criminal market will dissipate once adults are able to purchase safe products in a safe environment. But that is not necessarily what's happening in Colorado completely. Kids are using marijuana. Marijuana is frequently sold on Craigslist illegally. And according to some news reports this summer, there were about 1,000 marijuana plants, I think in July, with a street value of more than $4 million, and that grow operation was connected to the Mexican cartel. How do you prevent that from happening here?
I think that we have a great example when we look back at history, when we look at alcohol prohibition. When we ended alcohol prohibition, there was a transition period. And that transition period went from your Al Capones and gangsters that were essentially controlling the alcohol trade to today we have respected business people, including our own elected officials here in Arizona that are involved with the alcohol industry. Today you don't see the Miller Lite and Coors Light cartels shooting it out in the streets. We're going to go through a transition period when you're converting from an illegal market to a legal market. That does not happen overnight. It does not happen with the stroke of a pen. So there's a time period there, that transition. But that transition is working. When we look at Colorado, they sold in 2015 a combined sales of $996 million of marijuana. That's indisputable. That was marijuana that went through a taxed and regulated system, not through criminal black markets. So does this end the black market entirely? No, of course it doesn't. But there's a transition period there, just like when we look at the alcohol markets today. And that's an important consideration.
Mr. Montgomery?
Well, the transition period is even contemplated at 4 years later, where the Department of Marijuana Licensing and Control can begin to issue even more licenses for marijuana businesses in order to try to limit the ongoing illicit market. So even though in the findings of this initiative, the claim is that we're going to remove marijuana from the illegal market, it's even contemplated that 4 years later, and we're not even at that point within Colorado, that there's going to continue to be an illegal market. We still see the illicit market in Colorado. In fact, grow operations there are bringing in cartels from Cuba, Vietnam, Mexico. So it's not going away there at all. It gives the appearance of propriety, and so that brings the criminal element. And after Prohibition, those criminal organizations did not go away. And we still have a black market in alcohol today. We still have a black market in tobacco. So it's an illusion to think that just because you're going to create a regulatory environment and tax a particular product, you're going to get rid of illegal sales of that. And if we go back and look at what's going on in Colorado, we can't count the cost for the 64% increase in highway fatalities that they've seen there. I don't think 990 million, or however what the number is that proponents want to quote on that, is worth the increase in fatalities, or the 600% increase in children who are going to ERs.
Going to your point about the transition period, how long is reasonable enough of a transition? I mean, these things are still going on in Colorado. And will any program be perfect?
No program is ever going to be perfect. There's a black market for alcohol today. I have no idea where to go buy moonshine if I wanted it today, but I do know that it exists. So to say that we're going to eliminate the marijuana black market is simply a fallacy. It doesn't happen like that. That's just not reality. But we can substantially reduce it. Just like I don't know where to go buy illegal alcohol today. I think that there's a point in time where people won't know where to go buy illegal marijuana in the future. But that doesn't mean that it won't exist.
That's certainly a key selling point when you guys are campaigning.
It's an important one, and it's absolutely important. When we look at Colorado, almost $1 billion worth of sales went through a taxed and regulated system. That's putting a huge impact on that illegal market.
Okay. Looks like we have a question from a Facebook reader.
Yes, Yvonne, J-Rod on Facebook wants to know, how would it affect laws related to driving since the drug remains in your system for 30 days?
That's a good question. Did you hear that? Were you
I
guys able
did.
to hear that?
I did.
How will it affect impaired driving laws in Arizona?
Well, in terms of someone who may be driving 30 days after they first ingest, it won't affect anything. 2 years ago, the Arizona Supreme Court ruled that in order for prosecutors to bring an impaired driving case, you have to establish that someone has active metabolites in their system at the time that they're driving. And currently, we're able to do that with a blood test. But unlike what we do with alcohol, we're never going to be able to have a per se limit given the restrictive nature of the language in this initiative that was written by the dispensary owners. You know, presumably it was to address that problem with 30-day later use, but we don't have that. Additionally, we're not going to be able to regulate marijuana like alcohol with impaired drivers because we're not going to be able to come up with a per se limit. And Arizona's Voter Protection Act is going to prevent us from being able to go in and do anything with that because the language specifically states that you can't impose a penalty, and I'm speaking from the state angle in it, that the state may impose no penalty for an action taken while under the influence of marijuana. And now we're even talking about drawing blood to determine if someone's impaired. The language specifically states while someone is impaired by marijuana. So the specific question, this won't do anything with the 30 days later. We already have that addressed, but it will make other cases difficult.
JP?
I disagree wholeheartedly. There's nobody that's a part of my campaign that says it's okay for an individual to drive impaired under any substance, including marijuana.
Why didn't the initiative take this into account? Why didn't you establish some sort of standard that law enforcement might be able to use?
There's nothing in this initiative that prevents law enforcement in the state from establishing exactly one of those standards. I wholeheartedly disagree with the statement that this prevents that. In fact, this actually addresses this. And I'm just going to read verbatim because I think this is important. This chapter does not authorize any person to engage in and does not prevent the imposition of any civil, criminal, or other penalty on a person for, number one, operating, navigating, or being in actual physical control of any motor vehicle, train, aircraft, motorboat, or other motorized form of transport machinery while impaired by marijuana or marijuana products. Now, when it comes to the idea of a per se limit, the word per se is not in this initiative anywhere, and there is no prevention from the state from establishing exactly that.
And that has been a key point on this issue from proponents. The state legislature could come in and eventually establish some sort of limit.
Yeah, and that's from folks who are not familiar with how the law works in Arizona. I prosecuted these statutes firsthand. The language specifically states that you may not penalize somebody in the state for an action taken while under the influence of marijuana or a marijuana product solely because of the presence of metabolites or components of marijuana in their body or blood, saliva, urine, hair, or other tissue. We do that with alcohol. There is a per se limit of 0.08% blood alcohol concentration or higher. No other evidence is necessary. We can rely solely on that blood evidence to prosecute for impaired driving. This specifically states we can't do it. Now, it's being too cute by half to say, well, in one part of the initiative, it prohibits driving while impaired. If another part of the initiative takes away the evidence I would use to prove that. It's very similar to the statement that we've already heard today that in reality, even though in the findings this initiative states that we're going to remove marijuana from the illegal market, we finally have the acknowledgement that you're never going to get rid of the illegal market. So later on in the initiative where they say that more licenses could be issued in order to deal with, to try to minimize that illicit market, we now know that in fact proponents agree we won't get rid of that black market. And it is because of this particular provision too, where we eliminate the ability to use that evidence, that we run the risk of an increase in DUIs and fatalities.
And this is an issue that we'll be covering and delving more deeply into over the next month and a half or so, so stay tuned on that. Mr. Montgomery, criminalizing marijuana has not eradicated it, so why are you opposed to taking a new approach?
Well, first and foremost, the way we use the laws today allow us to intervene at the lowest level of use and gives us a chance to help someone go through substance abuse treatment. We now know that today current marijuana users are facing more use disorders than current alcohol users. And that's consistent with what we see in Colorado too, where the #1 substance being abused by adults is marijuana. It's no longer alcohol. The other thing to consider here too is that when we look at what our current laws are, we're not really seeing that much of an impact to our law enforcement resources or let alone who's being incarcerated. Arizona is a treatment first state. We've been that way for 20 years. So there's a misstatement about the reality of how we handle these laws in the first place. The other thing you've got to consider too is if you're going to eliminate penalties or take away the ability to try to deter the kind of conduct that we're seeing there, you're sending a message that we're somehow then accepting that kind of behavior. And when you look at what we've been able to do nationally, nationally 50% of Americans 12 and older regularly use alcohol, 25% 12 and older regularly use tobacco, 10% use illicit drugs. If you were to talk about any other activity where we could minimize Americans' involvement in it by 5 or 2.5 times less than something else, we'd call that a national policy success. It's only in trying to use 1930s rhetoric do we get involved in trying to say that this is somehow a drug. I've been at war. I know what war looks like. This is not a drug war. We've actually done well, and I'm afraid we're going to go in the opposite direction.
Your response to that?
The JLBC's report indicated that approximately 587,000 Arizonans are regular consumers of marijuana. Now, you can't tell me that prohibition works when you have more than 500,000 people in Arizona alone that are regularly consuming marijuana. But at the same time, in 2015, we arrested approximately 13,000 individuals in Arizona for simple marijuana possession. Now, marijuana possession in Arizona is a felony crime.
It's true.
Yeah, it is. That's what it is in the books. And that's why you also have to look into what do we really do in those 13,000 arrests. Half of them dealt with other offenses too. So
I'll
cut
be
that in
glad to
half,
not
about
interrupt
6,000.
the county attorney if he'll
about
let me answer
6,000.
questions as well.
Okay, go ahead,
addressed me,
Mr. Montgomery.
Yvonne.
That's
You
right. Go
addressed
ahead,
me.
Mr. Montgomery. Excuse me, Mr. Holyoke.
Sure. So those 14,000 people that we arrested in 2015, or I guess 13,000 approximately, there's a potential for a felony charge out there. Now, that's not to say that our prisons are clogged up with people that are having simple marijuana possession charges. They don't go to prison for it. Instead, they're going to a treatment program or a task force. Now, the vast majority of marijuana consumers are responsible marijuana consumers. This is not to say they need drug treatment. It's inappropriate, just like it'd be inappropriate for me to have drug treatment for consuming a glass of wine with dinner.
In Colorado, we saw an increase of marijuana use after legalization among youth. How do you foresee youth usage being affected here in Arizona?
I'm not sure I agree with that statement. I've got right in front of me the marijuana youth use among youth in Colorado survey. And the state of Colorado disagrees that there was an increase in youth use in the state of Colorado. So there are multiple studies that are out there, and the study that my opposition uses is from the Rocky Mountain High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. Now, there's a really interesting article that was just written last week in that ultra-left-wing liberal, pro-marijuana magazine called Forbes magazine. And the title of the article was "Dishonest Government Report Assumes Marijuana Legalization Has No Benefits." And essentially they went through and they said, hey, let's take a look and do a critical analysis of this Rocky Mountain High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area report. And they found that it was as biased could be. Moreover, the head of that organization, Tom Gorman, was an official spokesperson in opposition to Amendment 64 and a financial contributor to that effort in Colorado.
And Mr. Montgomery, you would debate the statistics that he's using as well.
Well, sure, and I've never quoted the Rocky Mountain High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area report. I've got the National Survey on Drug Use and Health that's put out as a national survey. And in every single age group in Colorado, they lead in past month usage rates among all states. Additionally, when you go back to 2002, 2003, before Colorado began their path towards legalization, and compare it to 2013, 2014 usage rates, they've increased dramatically. Teen use rates have increased. You can't just look at the surveys that have been taken by kids who are in school. You also have to factor in that the increase in expulsions and suspensions. And the most recent year, 2015-2016 school year, 62% of all suspensions and expulsions were related to marijuana. And for the last 4 years since legalization, the average for suspensions has increased 27% over previous to that.
It looks like we have another question from a viewer.
That's right,
Michael?
Yvonne from Facebook. Sherry McCloskey asks, what will happen when people smoke marijuana indoors with young children around? She adds, yes, secondhand smoke can make the kiddos high.
JP.
Hey, look, unfortunately, there is not a single law in this country that we could pass that would prevent stupid parenting. There are bad parents out there regardless. And criminalizing marijuana use does absolutely nothing to prevent that parent from doing the exact same thing under a prohibition system. So, of course, we don't want that. But the idea that we're going to have police in everybody's homes to prevent this, that doesn't make sense to us. And frankly, I don't want to live in a society where we have that type of a police force upon us. So laws don't prevent bad parenting as much as I wish they would.
But would Proposition 205 give some sort of sense of comfort or some sort of, lessen people's sense of risk when they're using some sort of this type of drug in front of their children?
Well, it's no different than consuming alcohol in front of your children. The children need to have honest conversations with their parents about alcohol, marijuana, or anything else. We see parents consuming alcohol in front of their parents. We see parents consuming alcohol to the point of inebriation in front of their children. I disagree with that as well, but that doesn't mean that we criminalize stupid behavior. Stupid people are stupid. It doesn't make them criminals, it makes them stupid.
Mr. Montgomery.
Well, I would say first, children don't get drunk from secondhand sweat, but they can get high from secondhand smoke. And actually, in this particular initiative, not only is encouraging people to exercise what becomes a statutory right to use, create environments in which children can be greater at risk, but the Department of Marijuana actually does create a brand new police force. The Department of Marijuana has far greater power than the Department of Liquor. The Department of Liquor is restricted to just those who are licensed under that title. The Department of Marijuana is also given authority to go out and investigate anyone who transfers marijuana for anything of value. So it's going to take more than the 60 sworn officers who are limited in their scope on the Department of Liquor to carry out the charge under the Department of Marijuana. So I don't know how they're going to protect the market and go around and engage in all the regulatory enforcement with the wide scope of authority that's been provided. The other thing to point out in here, too, is that there are particular protections for parents when it comes to family court and decisions made by family court judges that aren't available for parents who engage in the use of alcohol, tobacco, heroin, LSD, or methamphetamine. It's carved out specifically for marijuana users.
The Pro campaign has argued that legalization would free up police so they can spend more time addressing more serious crimes instead of enforcing these failed prohibition laws, as you say. But in Colorado, some law enforcement officials were here yesterday, and they say that that's not necessarily happening, that they're spending more time responding to illegal grow operations or to people who are illegally consuming it. How do you expect legalization to affect law enforcement here?
Well, I think this is a relatively simple common sense answer. We arrest approximately 14,000 people here a year for simple possession. They get arrested, they get booked, they get taken down to jail, they get processed, and then they're either released on their own recognizance or bailed out, and then they go through the system after that point in time. But we're arresting a whole lot of people. I think that law enforcement would be better off spending its time going after violent crimes and property crimes rather than individuals consuming something that's objectively safer than alcohol.
Mr. Montgomery.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Again, at least half of those between 13 and 14,000 arrests in 2015 involved other charges, not just possession of marijuana. So those arrests will continue. Of the remainder, then, if you can't make that arrest for the possession of marijuana offense, and if you do decriminalize that, there's nothing we can do from law enforcement until they go on and commit another offense. And that's what they're seeing in Colorado. They're spending their time now on more serious investigations and more serious crimes. That's what the reality is there. And again, if we're dealing with less than half of that 14,000, not everybody's arrested and booked. A lot of folks are just given citations. That's how we're able to review those cases and offer them treatment without ever filing a charge. And we do a lot of that too.
Here's something that it should be a follow-up to that. Colorado has already, prior to their legalization law, they had already decriminalized marijuana possession for up to an ounce. So individuals in Colorado that already had an ounce of marijuana on them were given a petty offense, not a felony charge. So it's a huge difference to talk about the comparisons of the actions and time resources of law enforcement.
Looks like we have another.
I was
you
going to say,
want to rebut?
well, yeah, because then that also further explains the impact of marijuana enforcement in the Denver area, where they've seen that officers now are having to spend more time dealing with marijuana offenses. It's because of the increased activity related then to marijuana use.
Looks like we have another question from a viewer. Michael?
Thanks, Yvonne. Eric Ferguson wonders, with passage of Prop 205, how many people will be released from prison or jail?
Well, it's hard. They're only 0.5% of individuals in Arizona's prison right now for the highest level offense listed as possession of marijuana. It's about 220 out of 42,300. But you got to keep in mind that in Arizona, where we're the main thoroughfare for drug trafficking into the United States, a number of those cases are also going to be pled down from possession of marijuana for sale or for transportation. And you have to commit 3 or more possession of marijuana offenses before you're even eligible to go to prison. So if we take all that into account, not many people are going to be packing their bags.
Under Prop 205, people would be able to grow marijuana plants in their homes. 6 plants, no more than 12 plants per home. It seems like an awful lot to some people. Why that number?
When we put that in there, I look at it as a freedom issue. You know, if I go to the grocery store and I buy my vegetables there, I don't know, that's okay. Just like somebody can go to a marijuana store and buy their marijuana. But I also maintain a garden at home where I actually provide many of the vegetables that my family eats at night.
But vegetables don't make you high.
Marijuana doesn't have to make you high either. That's one of the fallacies. That's one of the things that we're told over and over again. Marijuana is much more like alcohol in that just because I have a glass of wine with dinner doesn't make me drunk. And just because somebody consumes a little bit of marijuana doesn't make them high.
So how would you characterize that altered state?
It's no different than somebody having alcohol in limited quantities in a responsible manner. It's the same thing.
Mr. Montgomery?
Yeah, about 48% of adult users in Colorado are now regular marijuana users, and they're not going out and buying the 2 or 3% THC concentrated marijuana. They're going out and buying the 18%, upwards of 36% in the stores that are selling recreationally. They're going and buying the THC concentrates, the honey oil, the wax, the shatter. They can have THC concentrations in excess of 90%. So it's equally a fallacy to think that people are going to grow marijuana in their backyard without the goal of getting high. If that's really what they're doing, they just go out and buy a little bit, get their near beer version of it. But that's not what the retailers who are looking forward to selling this market are counting on. They're counting on people purchasing from them.
Mm-hmm. And people cannot sell their excess marijuana, correct?
That's correct. That would be a criminal activity.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not supposed to.
They're not supposed to. And we know that some of that is happening with the medical marijuana program.
Just like happens on the illegal market today.
Mr. Montgomery, you tried to prevent the state's medical marijuana law from being implemented.
Yeah.
If Proposition 205 is passed by voters, do you foresee any situation in which you would try to prevent it from being enacted?
Well, let's understand first what happened. I was sued by an entity that wanted to cite a medical marijuana facility in Maricopa County. I did not actively go out and sue. But once that happened, I did raise the issue that there is a conflict between state and federal law on this point. And my oath of office requires me to uphold the U.S. Constitution and the constitutional laws of the state of Arizona. Where we have a conflict of laws between federal law and state law, we go to court and we use the judiciary to resolve that case. I didn't do anything to go out and actively sue to stop that law to begin with. When it comes to recreational sales, my authority comes from Arizona law. And just like with the Medical Marijuana Act that says that if you are within the narrow confines of exemption from prosecution, I don't have jurisdiction, the same thing would happen with the recreational law. If it says that under Arizona law, a particular class of activity is not subject to prosecution, I don't have authority to prosecute it. So, the flip side of this is where I state that I have a particular oath to follow that both gives me jurisdiction and it takes jurisdiction away. And I follow my oath in both directions.
So you don't foresee any situation then?
Well, I don't know. Unlike the Medical Marijuana Act that required Maricopa County to engage in licensing and permitting and zoning activities, I haven't seen anything in this particular initiative at this point that might require that. If that were to come up, though, we'd have the same conflict between the Federal Controlled Substances Act and Arizona law. And again, if we're going to be a nation of laws, and not just of people who run around willy-nilly doing what they want, there's a process to follow to clarify that. I mean, we wouldn't even be in the situation we're at right now if we had a federal administration that would actually enforce the law. And that might be an even better way for us to have a Controlled Substances Act that permitted medicinal access, permitted medicinal research. I don't have a problem with any of that. It all has to do with, are we going to follow a lawful process, or are we going to thumb our noses at our rule of law and the system of laws that we have? That creates other chaos.
And are you anticipating a legal fight if Prop 205 passes?
Well, the reality is, as we sit here today, right now, there is a pending case that the county attorney has in front of the Arizona Appellate Court in an effort to overturn the medical marijuana law. Many of the same arguments that were made against the medical marijuana law are the same arguments that are being recycled today against the adult use law as well. So I would fully expect him to challenge that to the fullest extent of his ability. I would expect nothing less. But in Arizona, if you are a Republican and a so-called conservative, and your final answer is, well, the federal government told me so, well, then you're on probably the wrong side of that equation.
Proposition 205 gives medical marijuana dispensaries the first shot at obtaining retail licenses.
Correct.
Why is that, and is that fair?
The goal of this was to have both medical and adult use marijuana sold side by side. That was the intent here. So then it wasn't a question of whether or not these existing dispensaries would also be selling adult use. The real question would be, how many dispensaries are we going to have throughout the state? We put the number at 1/10 of the number of Series 9 liquor licenses, which as of today equates to approximately 150 dispensaries. There are currently 91 operational dispensaries in the state with 99 licenses that are out there. So it's about a 50% increase in the number of dispensaries that we have today. So the monopoly arguments don't make a lot of sense there. And then when we start comparing this to, say, McDonald's, there are 82 McDonald's in this state right now. We're looking at almost twice the number of dispensaries as there are McDonald's in this state, but I'm accused of trying to corner the market in that type of a scenario. The math doesn't add up.
Mr. Montgomery?
Yeah, well, you didn't have to restrict applications and issuance of licenses to current dispensary owners in order to accomplish that math. That's not how we did it when we first opened up the medical marijuana licensing process. It was a lottery for folks who could qualify and participate. So there didn't need to be any special interest protections for current dispensary owners. I think it's a facetious argument to say that in order to restrict the numbers, you had to restrict the numbers to just current dispensary owners. If the legislature tried to put this kind of language together, they would be accused of engaging in protecting a very narrow segment of the business market. And you would have a field day down there going around asking legislators, who gave you the okay to go ahead and do this? Is this something that really is protecting your constituency that you represent? And why are you doing this just for this particular class of business owner?
Looks like we have another question from a Facebook viewer. Michael.
Yes, Sean Green wants to know, what is going to be done about toxic or ineffective cannabis?
That's a good question. Pesticides are outlawed under Proposition 205, but what happens if they're found?
Well, there's a testing policy or a testing procedure that will be implemented as part of this law. Now, that part of that was not drafted into the statutory language. That would be part of the rules process. So when we look at some of the other states and the examples, and we can look at Colorado as an example, if somebody used some type of a banned pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, or otherwise, and it shows up in a test, which it unfortunately frequently does, that product is immediately pulled from the market because it is deemed to be unsafe, as it is, and it should be. And that's a big difference between what we have today in the criminal black market versus a taxed and regulated structure. Under a taxed and regulated structure, there's that testing requirement in there. So we know exactly what the potencies are. We understand that this has been a safe product. We know what went into the growing of that product, and so it's labeled appropriately. And so it provides consumer protections that the black market simply doesn't provide today.
Mr. Montgomery, looks like you want to respond.
Yeah, well, I would say that there still is going to be a limit to rules and regulations that are passed, because the initiative defines unreasonably impracticable as something that would make it too difficult to comply with those rules or ordinances. It's sort of a businessman's veto. We don't have this for any other type of industry or any other type of product line. It's just one more instance in which the marijuana industry is trying to protect itself.
Colorado's law left it up to individual towns and cities to decide whether they wanted businesses within their jurisdictions. Prop 205 does not give that type of flexibility.
It has what we call limited local control. And what I mean by that is any place that's currently a medical marijuana facility can continue on as an adult use facility. But if the city wants to ban additional facilities or even the moving of that existing facility, they can do so.
Mr. Montgomery?
Yeah, well, that's a perfect example of a local monopoly that the initiative creates. So if you unpack what was just said, then if you're a local town and you already have a dispensary there, you cannot prohibit not just the retail sale, but you can't prohibit that individual from getting licenses for the other 4 retail businesses that are provided for. Now, the current dispensary owner is fine if the town says we don't want any more, because then that protects their market and protects their sales volume. But the local town or even county can't opt out. 70% of cities and counties up in Colorado decided they didn't want to do this. We're stuck with it. And again, the Voter Protection Act won't allow us to go back and say that, you know what, this isn't working out for parts of Arizona. They ought to have the opportunity to exercise local control and say we don't want this. But this initiative under the Voter Protection Act and the way it's worded won't allow them to do it.
Okay.
I think we should address the Voter Protection Act because
Sure.
it's really interesting in how it came into its existence. In 1996, Arizona voters passed the medical marijuana law for the first time. And then immediately thereafter, in the next legislative session, they overturned that and they basically slapped the voters and said, you know, your vote didn't count on this, we're overturning it. So then the next voting opportunity, which was 1998, the same backers of that original medical marijuana law put the Voter Protection Act on the ballot, and it passed because the voters said, hey, state legislators, stop messing with laws that we pass. So the Prop 105 Voter Protection Act is in place only and solely because of the abuse that came about because of the original medical marijuana law.
Thank you for that history lesson, JP. The way it works is that the state legislature cannot make changes to ballot initiatives unless the changes further the intent of the law, and that has, been debated.
And being mindful of that history, proponents for this are now taking advantage of it to shove a whole bunch of other stuff in here that we're never going to be able to fix.
Is that deliberate?
I disagree with the premise that we shoved a whole bunch of other stuff in there that they couldn't fix.
Well, can we fix reducing youth access to marijuana from a petty offense and increase that offense so we're sending the same message to youth when it comes to drug use that we send for alcohol? If you use a fake ID to buy marijuana, it's a petty offense. If you solicit somebody else to buy marijuana for you as a youth, it's a petty offense. Those are both criminal misdemeanors under Arizona law. And in fact, those are for alcohol are criminal misdemeanors. And in fact, in Colorado, using a fake ID to buy marijuana is a criminal offense.
Let's talk about that.
There are some key changes.
Yeah, and we can't change that here. So if we do see the increase that's expected when we look at what happened in Colorado, and we look in Washington, we look at other states that have gone down the legalization road, we can't fix it. We won't be able to go back and do anything with it.
We're stuck with it.
Let's talk about that. That's important. I mean, it's something that's been hammered on here, that we've changed the criminal aspect for a 19-year-old kid or a 20-year-old kid that uses a fake ID to go buy marijuana. We know that 19 and 20-year-old kids do these types of things. Instead of saying, let's criminalize that dumb mistake by that 19-year-old, we said, let's find them and give them community service instead. Do we need to criminalize 19-year-old kids for using fake IDs? Of course not.
I want to see in here where that language is limited to 19 and 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds.
Okay, you guys will hash this out afterwards. It
there.
Sounds like we have another Facebook Live question. As you can see, both sides disagree on what is even in the ballot measure. Michael.
Thank you. Hector Page, it's not really phrased as a question, but there is a question in there. A couple of rich guys write themselves a law, Prop 205, to take control of all the cannabis in Arizona. J.P. Holyoke is creating his own cartel, and no one sees it. I guess this goes to kind of the monopolistic allegation we've seen out there from the anti-side of the campaign.
Can you respond?
I think we've addressed this already. We're looking at approximately 150 stores here in Arizona. There are 82 McDonald's in this state. To give you some other comparisons of this monopoly idea, and I've actually got some data back here on this, but it's really interesting to say, we have, actually I was wrong, 72 McDonald's in this state. More than twice the number. When we look at Starbucks, there's approximately 248. I wouldn't call that monopolistic either. There seems to be one on every other corner. There are 86 microbrews and 106 alcohol distributors. Now, those microbrewery licenses and the alcohol distributor licenses are also state-granted licenses. But we're not screaming monopoly about 106 alcohol distributors for something that's, objectively a far larger market with far fewer distributors. So this monopoly argument just doesn't hold water when you start looking at the facts.
Well, we're not talking about monopolies in those other areas, and those other activities aren't on the ballot this time. Proponents for 205 are stuck with the language that they put in this, and that they're trying to take cover under the Voter Protection Act from precluding us ever being able to rectify the market that's going to be created. The Colorado legislature 80 different times has worked on bills trying to fix some of the mistakes in that initiative. We won't be able to do any of that. The other thing people need to keep in mind, too, is that we're not just talking about restriction of the retail licenses to sale. It's also a restriction on the ability to grow. If you're a current dispensary owner, you are entitled, with the language that they put in this initiative, to grow an unlimited amount of marijuana. So where is all that marijuana going to go with those unlimited grows?
Pediatric hospital admissions related to marijuana have risen in Colorado since legalization. There are, I'm sure you guys will debate the statistics. How do you prevent that from happening here?
I think that we have to look at it in context. This is the report from the Rocky Mountain Poison and Drug Center. So when we look at 10 most common poison categories for children ages 0 to 5, in 2014, it was 92 children that were admitted. In 2015, it was 117. Now, no one wants children to be exposed to marijuana, to consume marijuana. That's simply wrong. But that comes down to responsible parenting. And I look at it much the same way as I look at firearms in the household today. I am a strong Second Amendment supporter. We lock up our guns because they can be dangerous to children. We should lock up marijuana and keep it away from children for the exact same reasons. But nonetheless, there are bad parents, accidents happen. But just like you're not taking firearms out of society because there may be people that do stupid things with them, it doesn't make sense to criminalize marijuana use either.
Mr. Montgomery.
Well, I'm grateful for the proponent's side for equating marijuana in the household as being a risk to children, similar to what a loaded gun might be, because if a kid happens to ingest that marijuana, depending upon the THC toxicity, they could wind up in the hospital, and it could be a serious situation for them. The other thing I would suggest, too, is so we already have categories of products that children are ingesting and going to the hospital for. So why are we going to deliberately add one more? And the other thing to keep in mind, too, is that in Colorado, because of that huge increase with respect to children eating edibles that were child-friendly, gummy bears, gummy worms, candy bars, Colorado outlawed it. We can't do that in this initiative. The Voter Protection Act will not allow the legislature to go in and tell the marijuana industry, you may not produce this type of product. It's not available.
All right, we're at closing statements. Mr. Holyoke, you first. Why should Arizona legalize marijuana?
Arizona should legalize marijuana because our policies of prohibition have been an abject failure. That's the number one reason. It simply didn't work. Why are we continuing to do something that doesn't work? The number two reason is an expansion of freedom. We need less big government and nanny state government telling us what we can and can't do. Number three, let's take that money away from the criminal drug cartels and instead fund our schools with it. We're ranked, what, 49th in the country in education funding? Let's send that money to our schools instead of drug dealers.
Mr. Montgomery, why should Arizona not legalize marijuana?
Because this initiative is another example of an industry overpromising and under-delivering. We've seen the risk of increased deaths and DUIs in other states that have tried to legalize this. And the fact is that when you tell someone they can use a product, they're going to use more of it. And the only hope for marijuana retailers to make more money is if they increase their user base. And increased widespread use, a reduction in the perception of risk, equates to increased teen use. So the promise of more money for education is a perverse promise when it's going to result in more teens using and not being able to take advantage of that education system this is going to purportedly fund. The $30, the $56 we might get a year per child is not worth the cost. Arizonans should vote no.
Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us, and thank you for joining us during your lunch hour. Please continue to follow our coverage on AZ Central. We'll be delving into a lot of these different topics and wading through a lot of statistics and studies in the month and a half leading up to the election.